The kid had been loud since he walked in. That's the thing nobody mentions afterward when they tell the story. They talk about what happened at the end, about the silence, about the moment the whole room seemed to hold its breath at once. But they forget about the beginning. They forget that it started long before anyone realized it was starting at all. Pearce Dillon had been coming to Sully's for 11 years, not every day. Some weeks he came in twice, some weeks not at all. But often enough that Maureen, who'd been working the counter since before the place got its liquor license, knew his order before he sat down. Medium coffee, 2 creams, no sugar. Same booth in the back corner, the one with the slightly uneven table leg that rocked if you put your elbow on it wrong. He didn't put his elbow on it wrong anymore. He'd learned the table the way you learn a quiet habit. He wore the same kind of thing most days. Dark work pants, a flannel shirt in winter, a plain cotton one in summer, and the hat. Always the hat. A faded olive green cap with a small badge on the front that most people in Sully's couldn't identify if you'd asked them to. A few of the older men might have recognized the insignia of 3 Commando Brigade, Royal Canadian Regiment, but they were never the ones who asked. The ones who asked were always the ones who knew the least. Pearce Dillon was 73 years old. He walked with a slight lean to the left that wasn't quite a limp, but wasn't quite not one either. His hands were thick and sistile, and he set them on the table like a man who'd learned a long time ago not to fidget. He didn't carry a phone that anyone ever saw. He read the newspaper sometimes, the actual paper kind, folding it into quarters the way men his age do. He ordered his coffee. He drank it. He watched the room the way you watch weather. Not anxiously, just attentively. The way a man watches something he's learned to read, but no longer fears. Nobody knew much about him. That was the other thing they'd forget later. They'd say, oh, everyone knew, as if it had been obvious all along. It wasn't. Pearce Dillon had lived in Pemberton, Ontario for better than a decade, and the most anyone knew about him was that he'd been in the military. You could tell by the hat, and by the way he sat with his back to the wall and his eyes to the door, and that he'd come from somewhere out west, maybe Saskatchewan, maybe farther. Maureen thought she'd heard him mention Moose Jaw once, years ago in passing. She couldn't be certain. He didn't talk about himself. Not because he was unfriendly. He'd ask after your kids. He'd comment on the hockey scores. He laughed at a decent joke, a real laugh, not the polite kind. But he turned conversations the way a good driver turns a truck, smooth, almost imperceptible, so that before you noticed it, you were talking about yourself instead of him. People walked away from those conversations, feeling good, feeling heard, and only later realizing they hadn't learned a single thing about the man they'd been talking to. That was Pearce Dillon. The group came in on a Friday evening in late October, when the sky outside had gone the colour of old pewter and the first real cold of the season was starting to mean something. 6 of them, young men in their mid-20s, a couple still in civilian clothes, and a couple in the early stages of changing out of uniform. Jackets unzipped, caps on backwards, the loosened look of men transitioning from one kind of world to another. They were loud from the moment they pushed through the door. Not mean loud, not yet. Just that particular brand of energy that comes from a group of young men who are all trying to be the funniest one. They took the big table near the window, ordered beers, ordered food. The noise level in Sully's went up a notch the way it does when youth arrives in a room. Not unwelcome, just present, the way a change in temperature is present. Most people didn't pay them much attention. Pearce Dillon didn't pay them any attention at all. He was on his second coffee by then, the newspaper folded beside him, watching the street. Maureen had said something to him about the forecast. Snow by Sunday, and he'd nodded and said about time, which was the most anyone could remember him saying about the weather. He seemed content. He seemed like a man with nowhere he needed to be, and no particular feeling about that one way or the other. The tallest one at the table was named Croft. Devon Croft. 26 years old, 6'3", the kind of build that gets noticed when it walks into a room. He'd done 2 years with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry before transitioning to a reserve role, which he mentioned to people more often than strictly necessary. He had the voice of a man who'd been told his voice commanded attention and had decided to make good use of that information. He was not a bad person. That's worth saying plainly. He was not a bad person. He was just young in the particular way that certain young men are young, where the thing they lack most is the awareness of what they lack. Croft was the one who noticed the hat. It happened gradually. He'd been glancing over for a few minutes, the way you glance at something in your peripheral vision that's snagging your attention without you quite knowing why. Then he said something to the man beside him. Pearce couldn't hear what, and there was a small ripple of laughter at the table. Then Croft said it a bit louder, for the benefit of the group. Old-timer's still wearing his dress-up hat. Pearce didn't react. He was looking at the street. This, as anyone who has been in that situation can tell you, was the wrong response. Not because he should have said something, but because silence, to a certain kind of young man, reads as an invitation to continue. "Hey," Croft called across the room, not aggressively, almost cheerfully. "Hey, Grandpa, that hat for show, or you actually do something?" The room got slightly quieter, not dramatically, just slightly. The way a room does when it senses something starting. Pearce Dillon picked up his coffee, took a sip, set it down. He turned his head and looked at Devon Croft the way you'd look at a dog that was barking at something it didn't understand. Not unkindly, just clearly. He didn't say anything. Croft grinned and looked back at his friends. "Think he heard me?" "Leave it," one of the others said. Shorter guy, dark-haired, the one who'd been quietest all evening. Pearce noticed that one. He noticed him because of the way he said it. Not embarrassed, not nervous, but with a specific kind of tiredness in his voice. The kind you hear from someone who's watched this particular performance before and knows exactly how it ends. But Croft didn't leave it. "Seriously, though," he turned back, raising his voice enough to carry. "What branch? Or is that one of those hats you pick up at the flea market?" There were a few snickers from the table. From the room, nothing. Maureen had stopped pretending to wipe the counter. The two men at the bar, both in their 50s, had both turned slightly on their stools. Pearce Dillon set down his coffee cup. He turned to look at Devon Croft fully then, and something about the completeness of that attention made the laughter at the table thin and then stop. It wasn't anger. It wasn't offense. It was simply the entirety of a man's focus, and it had a weight to it that was hard to describe afterward. People tried. Maureen would try later to explain it to her sister. It was like when a teacher turns around, she'd say, and then shake her head because that wasn't quite right either. It was like when something very big and very still moves, she finally said, and you realize it was never actually asleep. "Son," Pearce said. His voice was low and even and utterly unhurried. "What's your name?" Croft blinked. He hadn't expected to be asked a question. "Croft. Devon Croft? How long have you served, Corporal Croft?" Croft straightened slightly. He hadn't been called by his rank. 2 years regular force, and I'm still with the reserves. Pearce nodded slowly. "Patricia's?" A flicker of something crossed Croft's face. Surprise, maybe, that the old man knew enough to ask. "Yeah, good regiment," Pearce said, and he meant it. You could hear that he meant it. There was a pause. "Look, I didn't mean any. What do you know about 3RCR? Pearce asked. Croft hesitated. "Royal Canadian Regiment, 3rd Battalion. Bosnia, Afghanistan. They were in Panjwai, I think. Op Medusa to Matu 6, Pearce said. "Yes." Another pause. Longer this time. "Were you?" Croft started. "I was in a lot of places," Pearce said. He didn't say it to cut the conversation off. He said it the way you say something that is simply and completely true. "I was in a lot of places for a long time." He picked up his coffee again and looked at the street. The table near the window had gone very quiet. It was the dark-haired one who spoke next, the quiet one. He'd moved his chair back slightly from the table, the way you do when you're preparing to leave a conversation, and he was looking at Pearce with an expression that was harder to read than the others. "Excuse me, sir." His voice was different from Croft's, careful, like someone's selecting words off a shelf. "Your badge on the cap. That's 3 Commando, isn't it?" Pearce looked at him. "It is. My grandfather served with 3RCR, the young man said, in Cyprus, 1974. The room had gone very quiet now, fully quiet. The two men at the bar had turned completely around. Pearce Dillon set down his cup for the 3rd time. He looked at the young man steadily. "What's your name?" "Leclerc," the young man said. "Owen Leclerc." Pearce was still for a moment. Then something moved across his face, not quickly, but visibly, like light changing through cloud cover. He looked at Owen Leclerc with an attention that was different from how he'd looked at Croft. More inward, more careful, the look of a man finding something in his memory and not yet sure what to do with it. "Your grandfather," he said. "His first name Robert," Owen said. "Robert Leclerc. He passed in 2019. The silence in Sully's had taken on a different quality by then. It was no longer the silence of a room watching something unfold. It was the silence of a room that understood without quite knowing why, that something was about to matter. Pearce Dillon looked at Owen Leclerc for a long moment. "Bob Leclerc," he said quietly, "C Company." Owen Leclerc's face changed. "You knew him?" It wasn't a question. The way he said it was not a question. "We went into the buffer zone together," Pearce said. August of '74. There was an incident. The detail doesn't matter now, but there was a moment where I had to make a decision quickly, and the decision I made meant Bob Leclerc walked out instead of not walking out. He paused. He would have done the same for me. He nearly had to, other times. The room was absolutely still. Devon Croft was sitting with his hands flat on the table, his beer untouched in front of him, looking at Pearce Dillon with an expression that had nothing left of the earlier evening in it. "He never talked about Cyprus," Owen said. His voice had changed too. Younger, somehow, the way voices go when they're reaching for something. He'd mentioned he was there, but he never said what happened. "No," Pearce said. "He wouldn't have." Did he know your name? Did he know? We stayed in touch for a while. Letters, at first. Then less. Then the way things go. Pearce shook his head slightly. "I knew he'd settled in Ontario somewhere. I lost the address." Owen Leclerc stared at him. "You're the one," he said slowly. It sounded like something clicking in place. "He told my grandmother once that she knew about. He said there was a man in Cyprus. He called him the steadiest man he'd ever seen. That was it? That was the whole story. The steadiest man." He wouldn't say more. The silence held. Pearce Dillon looked at the young man across the room and didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it had been all evening. Low, unhurried even. "He was a good soldier," Pearce said, "and a good man, and I'm glad he had years after." Owen Leclerc had to look away. He looked at the table, then at the wall, then, with some visible effort, back at Pearce. "Thank you," he said. I don't know what else to say." "You don't need to say anything else," Pearce said, and he meant that too. Devon Croft stood up slowly. There was nothing performative about it. He didn't make a speech. He walked across Sully's to the corner booth, and he stood there for a moment, and he said, "Sir, I'm sorry for what I said earlier. I was out of line." Pearce looked up at him. "Sit down if you want." Croft sat. They talked for a while. Nobody could quite hear what they were saying. Pearce was never a loud talker, but people saw Croft lean forward with his elbows on the table, nodding, and once or twice pressing his hand briefly over his eyes, the way men do when they don't want anyone to notice what's on their face. At some point, Maureen brought over 2 fresh coffees without being asked. That was the kind of place Sully's was. The rest of the table had gone quiet. Owen Leclerc sat with his hands wrapped around his glass, not drinking, thinking something through. He looked like a man reassembling a story he thought he'd already finished. Later, much later, after Pearce had gone home, he left the same way he always left, unhurried, with a nod to Maureen and nothing else. Croft sat at the bar and looked at his beer. "I didn't know," he said, to nobody in particular. "That's kind of the point," the man next to him said. One of the 50s men from earlier. He had a flat Cap Breton accent and a wedding ring worn down to almost nothing, and the look of a man who'd been listening all evening. "You never know. That's always the point." Croft turned that over. "What do you know about him?" he asked. "The old man. Do you know anything about him?" The man at the bar shrugged. "Same as you. He drinks his coffee, he reads the paper, he says hello and he means it, and he doesn't say much else." He picked up his drink. "But I've seen men in my time, and I've seen the ones that have been somewhere real, and that man has been somewhere real." "Cyprus," Croft said. "He was in Cyprus." "And wherever else," the man said. "There's always wherever else." What nobody knew, what Pearce Dillon had never told anyone in Pemberton, and would not have told anyone that night either, if it hadn't come out sideways through a 26-year-old corporal's careless question, was that the incident in Cyprus in August of 1974 was not what you would call minor. It was the kind of incident that makes it into internal military documents under language so dry and administrative that you'd read the whole thing without realizing anyone nearly died. What the documents said in their flat bureaucratic prose was that during a patrol into the UN buffer zone on August 16, 1974, in the aftermath of the Turkish military advance, a section of 4 men from C Company, 3rd Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment, became isolated when a firefight broke out between Turkish forces and Greek Cypriot irregulars without warning or warning-adjacent signals. What the documents did not say was that Corporal Pearce Dillon, he was 21 years old then, and he had been in the army for 3 years and in Cyprus for 4 months, had gone back. They'd been pulling back to the UN checkpoint. two men were ahead. Dillon and Private Robert Leclerc were rear. There was a moment of confusion, a gap, and then Leclerc was down. Not shot, but caught in the blast scatter of something that had gone off closer than it should have. And the two men ahead were already through the checkpoint, already yelling for cover, and the question of whether to go back or not took perhaps 2 seconds. Dillon went back. He crossed 40 meters of open ground that was receiving fire from 2 directions. He got to Leclerc. He got Leclerc up. He got them both back through the checkpoint and behind cover without either of them dying. Though Leclerc had a punctured eardrum, and Dillon had 2 places on his right side where fragments had found him, which he didn't mention until the following day because he'd thought they were bruises, and they weren't bruises. He was 21 years old. Afterward, when the section commander tried to write him up for something, Dillon shook his head and said he'd just done what needed doing and he'd rather not make a thing of it. The section commander, a man named Vickers, who'd been doing this long enough to know what he was looking at, wrote it up anyway. The paperwork moved through the system, received a commendation, and ended up in a file that Pearce Dillon didn't talk about and that most people in Pemberton, Ontario had no way of knowing existed. He had been 21 years old. He was 73 now, and he drank his coffee in the same booth and folded his newspaper into quarters and asked after your kids, and the citation was in a box somewhere, probably, and if you'd asked him about it, he would have changed the subject with such smooth and practiced ease that you'd have walked away, wondering how you ended up talking about your own kids. Owen Leclerc drove back to his apartment that night with the radio off. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about the way Robert Leclerc had never talked about Cyprus, except to say he'd been there, and that it had been a long time ago, and that some things you carry quiet. He thought about the word his grandmother had used, steady, and how he'd always understood it as a character description, a personality trait, something vague. He hadn't understood that it was the name of a specific man who had gone back across 40 meters of open ground and changed the whole downstream of a family's existence. His mother had been born in 1977. He had been born in 2000. Both of those facts were, in some distant and uncountable way, downstream of August 16, 1974. He sat in his parking spot for a long time after he'd turned the engine off. Devoncroft drove home a different way than usual. He wasn't sure why. He went through the long way around, down by the water, where the October wind was pushing whitecaps across the lake and the shore lights were smearing in the dark. He thought about what it meant to serve, not what he'd been told it meant, not the version he'd grown up with, the movies and the speeches, the real version. What Pearce Dillon's version looked like. A man who had done something extraordinary and then simply continued to live, who drank his coffee and read his newspaper and said about time when you mentioned snow, who turned conversations like a river turns around rock, smooth and without drama, so that you never found yourself looking directly at what he'd been. He thought about the word steady. He thought about the fact that Pearce Dillon, at 21, had known exactly what to do in 40 meters of open ground under fire, and that at 26, Devoncroft had needed 15 minutes and a stranger's complete attention to learn how to apologize properly. He didn't know what to do with any of that, not yet, but he could feel it settling in him, the way cold settles into bones, not unpleasant, just real, a weight he'd carry differently now. Maureen wiped down the corner booth last, the way she always did. She did it slowly. She wasn't sure why. She'd worked at Sully's for 22 years, and she had seen things in that room. She had seen proposals and arguments, and one time a man who had not been sober in 11 years, who came in and ordered a club soda and sat alone for an hour, and then walked out and never came back. She had seen grief and reunion, and the ordinary accumulated texture of a small community doing what small communities do. She was not a sentimental person particularly, but she wiped down that corner booth slowly, and she stood there for a moment after, looking at the table with the slightly uneven leg, the one that rocked if you put your elbow on it wrong. She made a note to fix it. She wasn't sure why she'd never fixed it before. She thought he might actually prefer an even table. He'd probably never said anything, because it wasn't his booth to complain about, and he wasn't the kind of man who complained about things. She turned off the lights in the back one by one and thought about a man who had been 21 years old in a place. None of them would ever go, and who had spent the next 52 years sitting quietly in the corners of rooms and asking after people's kids and meaning it, and who had never once in 11 years of medium coffees and folded newspapers suggested that he deserved anything more than what he had. The loudest voice in any room gets heard first. That's just physics. Sound travels. But there's another thing that travels, slower and quieter and farther. It travels through the way a man holds himself at a table, through the completeness of his attention when he gives it, through what he does not say about himself year after year, until the one evening when the silence finally speaks for him. Pearce Dillon was home by 10. He made himself tea, the same as every night, and sat by the window looking at the street. A light snow had started, the first one, just enough to catch the street lights. He watched it for a while. He thought about Bob Leclerc. He thought about a young man named Owen who had his grandfather's eyes. He'd seen it immediately, and he'd said nothing. Because that was the kind of thing you held quietly. The way Bob would have held it. He thought about the Corporal Croft. He thought there was something there worth paying attention to, underneath the noise. There usually was. He finished his tea and went to bed. He left the newspaper folded on the table for morning. Outside, the snow came down soft and steady over Pemberton, over the dark lake and the lit windows and the empty street, over Sully's where Maureen had turned out the last light and locked up, and it kept coming, quiet and even and without any need at all to announce itself. The steady ones don't need to. They just keep showing up, year after year, coffee after coffee, until the night the room goes quiet enough to finally hear what they've been saying all along.